Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you joining us. Thank you for being here today. My name is Nadia Daar. I'm head of Oxfam International's Washington, D.C. office, and I will be moderating this press conference today, organized by Icrict, the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, and hosted by Oxfam and Tax Justice Network, TJN. Icrict, as many of you will know, is a group of leaders from around the world who believe that there is both an urgent need and an unprecedented opportunity to bring about significant reform of the international corporate and wealth taxation system. Icrict was initiated and is supported by a coalition of civil society and labor organizations, including Oxfam and TJN. At this moment in history, while the pandemic is still not over for many countries and we're facing yet further compounding crises that risk increasing poverty and inequality, Icrict is today urging G20 leaders and interested partners to immediately convene an urgent international summit to address offshore wealth, the toxic role of tax havens, and deploy a fast plan to implement a global asset registry. We see that the convergent crises of COVID-19, of inequality, and the rising food prices could push over 250 million people into extreme poverty by the end of this year. Meanwhile, government coffers are quickly depleting with costs of the pandemic and high debt servicing. We see countries turning to international financial institutions, especially the International Monetary Fund, but in return, the IMF is also requiring austerity measures in most of these countries, as demonstrated by new research out from Oxfam today. And at the same time, we see billionaire wealth skyrocketing and the world's richest men's wealth doubling since the start of the pandemic. And so we're at a crucial moment where political action is necessary and sound direction from international organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, and the G20 could make a difference in preventing countries from sliding into chaos. The scale of hidden wealth has emerged again because of the war in Ukraine, yes, but it is not only about tackling the wealth of Russian oligarchs. It is a systemic problem that undermines democratic principles. There are choices to be made, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Now, before we get to our esteemed speakers, I just want to mention some important housekeeping points you'll want to remember. The press conference will run for a total of 45 minutes. It will be video recorded and be made available after the event. And the last part of the event will include, of course, a Q&A for all of you to bring in your questions. So please type those questions, as I mentioned earlier, by clicking on the Q&A icon, not the chat box on the side. Provide your name, your outlet, and who your question is targeted to. And you can type your question in English, French, or Spanish, and you can do that as the panelists are speaking. You don't need to wait until they've finished, and then I'll be reading out your questions. So let me get started. Let me introduce our distinguished panel, all of whom are, of course, members of Icrict. We have today with us José Antonio Ocampo. He is the chair of Icrict and a professor at Columbia University. He's a former Minister of Finance of Colombia and former United Nations Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. We have Professor Gabriel Zucman. He is a professor and director of the Stone Center on Wealth and Income Inequality at the University of California at Berkeley and director of the EU Tax Observatory. And we have today joining us Jayati Ghosh. She is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and a member of the United Nations Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. So let me first start with a quick and straight question to Icrict's chair, José Antonio Ocampo. Why is Icrict launching this new declaration today ahead of tomorrow's G20 Finance Ministers meeting and in the week of the IMF and World Bank spring meeting? So why is now the time to tackle offshore wealth, and what exactly are you asking of G20 leaders?
Well, thank you very much, Nadia, and I'm very glad to be with all of you, and not only with Jayati and Gabriel, the partners in Icrict. Let me start by saying that the idea of a global asset registry has been in the Icrict agenda for a few years already. It's a very important proposal which actually is extremely relevant today. First of all, for the reasons you mentioned, the high levels of poverty that we have inherited from the pandemic, plus the increasing food prices that we're facing since the end of last year, which had been enhanced by the Russian invasion to Ukraine. Now, the idea of a global asset registry has come to the fore, in a sense, by the proposals of some developed countries, to tackle the issue of the oligarchs from Russia, and to have penalties on them. And then when it has come clear that even the money from the oligarchs is actually hidden and cannot be captured totally, which is exactly why we need a global asset registry. So the problems that associated to the fact that some of the money from the very rich people are hidden is associated to several problems. First of all, because it doesn't capture capital income for income taxes, which is a very important issue. Second, and closely associated to that, because it generates or it helps to generate regressive tax systems, because you are actually not capturing the money from the richest of the world, which is again hidden. And third, and very importantly, because the tax havens and other ways of hiding money is actually supporting corruption and illegal capital flows of all types, which undermine democracy. So the idea of a global asset registry, in a sense, has both economic as well as political principles, which are extremely important. So the idea of the registry is actually to build on national registries in order to capture the money that is hidden, allowing for wealth taxes, but not only for wealth taxes, actually also capturing well the capital income associated to that wealth, and then using that for the purpose of supporting the social programs and other government programs that you mentioned in the beginning. So what is also important is that the final beneficiaries be identified for all sorts of assets, because one of the major problems that we have, which has been again very clear in when trying to penalize the Russian oligarchs, is that some of the money is not is hidden in accounts or societies or partnerships with other people, and you don't know exactly how to capture the money or the ones you want to capture. And for all those reasons, you have to have a national registries based on final ownership of the different assets, and then integrating them into a global system, so you are able to capture all the resources for the purposes of increasing your income tax at the national level, but also countries that want to do that to establish also wealth taxes.
Very good and very clear. Thank you. Thank you for that. Gabriel, I want to turn to you. You're probably one of the most recognized voices to have been raising the issue of hidden offshore wealth. Can you give us an idea of the scale of the problem we're talking about and what the implications of this are?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So globally, according to the estimates that we have, the equivalent of about 10% of world GDP is held in tax havens globally. So that's about $8 trillion today in financial wealth, things like bank deposits, portfolios of equities and bonds and mutual fund shares that are held in offshore financial centers in Switzerland, in Singapore, in the Cayman Islands, in Luxembourg, all over the world. And the second thing that we've learned, from research in this area over the last few years is that offshore wealth is very concentrated. Typically, about more than half of it belongs to households at the very top of the wealth distribution. Think, the top 0.01% wealthiest individuals. And so, not all that wealth necessarily evades taxes. Some of it is duly declared to tax authorities. There's been tremendous progress over the last decade in terms of information exchange across countries. Now there's an automatic exchange of bank information between offshore financial institutions and tax authorities in a number of countries, not all of them, but especially in high-income economies. And I'm not saying that it has fixed the problem entirely, the problem of offshore tax evasion. It would be a bit naive to believe that the very same bankers who for decades have been helping their clients evade taxes, sometimes taking extreme measures, smuggling diamonds into toothpaste tubes, for instance, that these very same individuals today are honestly, truthfully cooperating with all the world's tax authorities. But the legal framework, the regulatory framework has evolved in a very positive direction, such that today a significant fraction of the wealth that's held in tax havens is actually duly declared. Despite that, there's still tax evasion going on. There's still money laundering. Offshore financial accounts are still used for all sorts of crimes, and it's very important to shed more light on what's happening in those havens.
Thank you for that. The diamonds and toothpaste is going to stay with me for some time. But we've talked about the problem now. Let's get to the solutions, right? And as Icrict, as José Antonio Ocampo already spoke about, you are calling on the G20 leaders to act now and start by adopting this Global Asset Registry. Can you go deeper a little bit and help us understand more about this idea? What makes it so revolutionary, and how significant an impact could it have?
Yeah, look, I'm not even sure it's so revolutionary, right? Because the starting point is we have real estate and land registries already. And countries have had those registries for a very long time, for centuries. In France, for instance, where I come from, the French Revolution created the French real estate and land registry in 1790, more than 2 centuries ago. And at the time when these registries were created, the bulk of wealth was indeed real estate and land. So that by creating a registry to record the ownership of those assets, what countries did is they, in effect, recorded the ownership of almost all wealth, because that, at the time, almost all wealth was real estate and land. What has happened since then is that today, financial wealth plays a much more important role than in the past. More than half of household financial wealth, more than half of household total wealth typically is financial wealth. And yet the registries that exist have not kept up with the changes in the nature of wealth that have happened over the last century or so. And so the idea of a financial registry or global asset registry is to say, look, we should modernize these existing institutions, these existing tools, to do 2 things. Number one, to do a better job at identifying the beneficial owners of the assets. Because in the land and real estate registries that exist today, a significant fraction of real estate, and especially high-end real estate, is owned through shell companies. And so in the registries, you don't see the identity of the beneficial owners of those assets. But this identity is known because intermediaries have to know who are the beneficial owners of the wealth that they manage. And so number one, these registries could be improved by making sure that the identity of the ultimate beneficial owner is recorded. And number two, it would be logical to extend the existing registries to financial assets so as to get back to the original intent of those registries, which is to cover the ownership of all forms of wealth and most of the wealth of households. That's the idea.
Very clear. Thank you. I want to go back to, Jose Antonio mentioned that the global registry would also be built on national registries. And you've recently proposed this creation of a European asset registry as a stepping stone toward ultimately a global assets registry. Why are you proposing that we start there, and how exactly would that work?
Yeah, look, we have to start somewhere, right? So I think the natural starting point is the national registries that exist, land and real estate registries. Number two is to extend those registries, as I was describing, to incorporate financial assets. And then we live in a globalized world, right, where wealth accumulation takes place, in several countries, across borders. And so it would make sense to connect the various registries that exist so as to have a comprehensive picture of the wealth owned by people. A natural starting point, you could have two countries agreeing to connect their registries. It could be the United States and Canada, it could be France and Germany. A natural next step would be to have regional registries. You could have regional registries in the European Union. The European Union could be a leader in creating financial transparency of that sort. You could have regional registries in Latin America, for instance. And then ultimately, yes, you could then connect these various regional registries to arrive. That's the ultimate goal, but it may take decades before we arrive to that point, to arrive at a truly global asset registry. But what I want to say is that we don't need to start immediately with a global registry. I think there's a process where we get there by building on what exists, which is already valuable and important and covers a significant fraction of wealth, and gradually expanding, connecting the registries, and ultimately to arrive at that goal of a global asset registry.
Got it. So it's pushing for this commitment to have a global assets registry and creating that roadmap for how that would happen, and there are steps in between. Jayati, I want to come to you now. We know the problem of offshore wealth is not limited to rich oligarchs in rich countries and in the global north. It's happening everywhere. But the implications are already destabilizing more developing countries. Can you talk to us a little bit about the impact of offshore wealth for developing countries specifically? And what kinds of risks are we looking at if nothing is done to tackle this huge problem?
Thank you, Nadia, for this. I would actually argue that developing countries are disproportionately worse affected by this whole pattern of what you could call illicit financial flows, the capital flight. And the amounts are huge relative to the incomes and the fiscal capacities of states in developing countries. For example, my colleagues here in UMass, Leonsin Ducomana and James Boyce, they have estimated that in the 45 years between 1970 and 2015, just 30 African countries lost about 1.4 trillion in capital flight. I mean, for Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, UNCTAD has said that it's nearly 90 billion in illicit capital flight every year. That's almost 4% of the continent's GDP, which is being lost every year, much, much more than the aid flows coming in. And over the past 5 decades, more than 2 trillion in sub-Saharan Africa has gone to capital flight. The point that Gabriel has made is so important because it's not just that there are the takers. And this is a point that Ndikumana and Boyce make in their book as well. It's not just the people in Africa, the elites, who are siphoning off and taking this money, but that it becomes completely legal in the destination countries. In other words, the laws are such, they are so lax, that they allow all kinds of people and ill-gotten wealth to be held in forms that do not reveal the beneficial ownership. So it's impossible to trace it, it's impossible to do follow-up action, and it's enabled by a vast array of lawyers, bankers, financial agents who actually are very much party to this massive extraction. And to give you an example, Angola could be one of the richest countries in Africa, but all that massive oil resources has just enriched a very, very small elite and the multinational oil companies. I mean, it's estimated to have lost 103 billion between 1986 and 2018, which is as much as the GDP of Angola in 2018. And yet this is a country in which only 7% of the rural population has access to even electricity. And half the population doesn't have access to drinking water and basic sanitation. So yes, there is extraction by the elites, but it is a global system of enabling this extraction to find perfectly legal avenues, which is the real problem. Because if this did not exist, then in fact, the current Angolan government could go after those who have extracted this money and get some of this back. So the fiscal implications of this are huge. We know that in the pandemic, most low and middle income countries simply couldn't spend anywhere near what the advanced economy spent in terms of the share of GDP. But in absolute numbers, the numbers were horrific. In 2020, the US, 2020 and half of 2021, the US government must have spent more than $30,000 per head in pandemic relief, the government alone. Low-income countries spent about $2 per head. That's the kind of difference we're talking about.
Very stark indeed, and the example of Angola and what we could imagine Angola to have been had this problem not been occurring is a very good one indeed. Jose Antonio, you've been a regular participant at the IMF and World Bank meetings. You know well how things work here in DC. Last week, the IMF put out one of their chapters of their fiscal monitor, and for the first time, they called for more coordination, not just on taxing corporations, but also on taxing individuals. They also discussed implementing national beneficial owners registers. So from your experience, what role could the IMF play in tackling offshore wealth?
Well, let me say that the IMF plays, of course, a very fundamental role in coordination of, let's say, of ministers of finance and generally of international financial cooperation. But on fiscal issues in particular, there are three things that are very important. The first one, and based on my experience as finance minister, the support to countries is quite good. So in different areas, so if they get into supporting the development of national registries based on the principle of beneficial ownership, I think that will be a fantastic idea. Okay. In fact, as part of a broader support to transparency in international finance and international taxation. That's the first issue that I want to. Second, they do a lot of research. And the research on fiscal issues is quite important. For example, in all this debate about the importance of international tax cooperation, in which we have been involved as Icrict, I'll tell you that I have found the IMF studies much more precise than the OECD studies. So for that reason, it's also quite important. And third, of course, in their programs, they request fiscal austerity many times. So given the circumstances and the importance of social spending, given the legacy of the COVID-19 plus the growing food prices, which have been worsened by the Russian invasion to Ukraine, all of that means that you hardly should use government austerity policies. What you need is revenues. And this is precisely what you can actually do through a good management of the that can be done through Global Asset Registry. So I applaud the idea of both the proposal to have a beneficial ownerships at the national level, as well as more coordination for taxing individuals, including by the wealth for those countries that want to have wealth taxes. individual and not only corporate taxes. Actually, in my country, Colombia, actually generally has had a wealth tax. So for that reason, that is also a contribution. Actually, by the way, the history of the wealth tax in my country is because it is generally perceived that you cannot capture all capital revenues through the normal systems, and therefore the wealth tax is again a kind of a way of compensating for that, so that the wealthy people pay taxes also their wealth, and not only the capital income, which is generally underestimated. So the additional revenue that can be done through all these policies is a good proposal from the IMF, as well. Let me underscore that as the transparency that should be built into a system of international cooperation in tax matters.
Thank you. And final question to Jayati. And sort of building on what Jose Antonio was referencing with respect to IMF and austerity, I know you have been extremely vocal on the risks of austerity. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, our new research is showing that 87% of the IMF's recent COVID-19 loans are now requiring austerity as a condition of financing. To what extent would you say that identifying and taxing wealth is an alternative to austerity?
I mean, there's no question. It's absolutely obvious. You are giving up on potential revenues that are really low-hanging fruit and would also at least somewhat address the massively increasing inequality that has occurred in all of our countries. So if the IMF has to impose conditions that require some degree of fiscal consolidation, why doesn't it look at the tax side? And if it looks at the tax side, why does it only think of regressive taxes like more VAT? Or even the carbon taxes that fall disproportionately on the poor? Why doesn't the IMF, in its conditionalities, for example, create a national wealth asset register, find out who owns what as part of the conditions of the loan? Why does it not say impose a wealth tax, or at the minimum a solidarity tax on the extremely wealthy, the 0.1% of the population whose incomes have doubled, tripled, whose assets have gone up 4 or 5 times? These are fairly simple things. These are low-hanging fruit that are available to developing countries. They're terrified of doing it because there will be massive pushback from the wealthy and of course threats of capital flight once again. If the IMF were really serious about enabling sustainable recovery, the conditions it should impose are these. It should be asking for taxing the extremely wealthy whose wealth has gone up. It should be requiring asset registers of every country in which it actually comes in with a program. It should be enabling that country to set controls on the capital account, which limit the possibilities of capital flight. Those would be the sensible conditionalities to impose.
Thank you for that. And so with that wraps up our speakers' remarks. And so I want to turn now to our questions from the journalists joining us today. A reminder to please type your questions into the Q&A function, not the chat box, and provide your name and outlet, who your question is for. As I mentioned, you can do so in English, French, or Spanish. And a reminder also that the recording of the session will be available on YouTube via the Tax Justice Network website. So with that, let me turn to our first question, and it is for Jose Antonio, and it comes from Miguel Ramirez in Puesto, Mexico. Who would be responsible for this asset registry that you have all been speaking about today? Which global body, if any, would be a leader in coordinating and helping implement this global asset registry? And how would such a huge undertaking happen? Do you see this happening at the UN level, the OECD level? Go ahead, Jose Antonio.
Well, let me say that the first and most important step is to construct national registries. So in that regard, the first and most important responsibility is for individual governments. Okay. Now, second, as Gabriel also pointed out, the idea of doing regional registries is a good one in the step to to develop a global registry. Even without the global body, you could start to get information. I mean, for example, during the 2008-2009 crisis, the US was very strong with Switzerland on information about the accounts of Americans in Switzerland. So you can get through tax authority, you could start exchanging information, even if you don't have no global body, let's say, in that regard. Although a global agreement, let's say, is of course, will be a step forward. Now, so you can build regional registries, and then whether you go into doing the global asset registry itself I don't think it's an immediate demand. Well, it's not an immediate step. I think the national registries are the most important and urgent. Developing regional registries and then an agreement of how the tax authorities can exchange information that is built on asset registry. By the way, one very important thing in all of this process is the information from tax havens. And trying to control tax havens, and basically, for example, avoiding financial transactions if there is no transparency on the information provided by tax havens. So an agreement in that regard will be a very important step.
Great, thank you. So the next question is coming to us. Actually, it's in two parts from Sarah Paez from Tax Analyst, and it's for both Gabriel and Jayati. So Gabriel, first, the United States is a leader in requesting tax and financial information on its own citizens. You know, we can look at FATCA, but however, its state laws in Delaware and South Dakota, for example, are allowing foreign entities to hide their beneficial ownership and hold untaxed wealth and property and other investment vehicles. How can Icrict appeal to the US in particular as a key leader in the G20 to improve its own laws? We've already seen efforts on the federal level in the Corporate Transparency Act, but how could it go further? And then just to go to Jayati right after that, we would want to hear the same, you know, if you have anything to add on that, but especially what would it mean for developing countries if the US were able to take more steps on that? Go for it, Gabriel.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very important question. And it's 100% true that there is considerable financial opacity in the United States, and there is a need for much more transparency. There is a wide range of evidence showing that real estate markets in the US, financial markets in the US, hedge funds and so on, are used for money laundering sometimes, for avoiding international sanctions, for tax evasion, and so on. And so it's very important to make progress in that area. How do we make progress? Well, number one, by being through exemplarity. You know, look, if the European Union tomorrow said, we're going to create an EU asset registry that's going to be comprehensive, it's going to identify beneficial owners, it would put pressure on the United States and other economies to do the same. If you're, exemplary, if you show the way, if you lead, pave the way, if you're a leader, then it also becomes possible to say, look, if you don't want to create transparency, then maybe there should be some form of economic sanctions. You know, it's something that the US did, for instance, as José Antonio reminded us, at the time of FATCA around 2010, the United States basically told Swiss banks, well, if you don't want to exchange information with us, then you will face the threat of concrete economic sanctions like taxes on payments made out of the United States to Switzerland. And under the threat of those sanctions, Swiss banks agreed to cooperate and to send the relevant information to the US tax authority. And this approach can be generalized. If number one, you yourself are transparent, you are a leader in creating financial transparency, then you are in a strong position to tell others, look, you should do the same. Otherwise, there may be a cost in refusing transparency and cooperation.
Thanks, and over to you, Jayati.
Yeah, thank you. I think, Gabriel is absolutely right. The difficulty for developing countries is that if we sanction, people don't notice. In other words, we don't have that comparative power and the clout to make it, worthwhile for the advanced economies. And it's unfortunate but true that advanced countries share information amongst themselves, which they do not reveal to the developing countries, although many of them have been asking for it. I'm hoping that this Russian invasion of Ukraine will serve as a bit of a game changer, because I think more and more people in the West are realizing that it also comes back to bite you. That if you allow this kind of lack of knowledge of beneficial owners, whether it's in Delaware or somewhere else, you will actually end up not knowing, if you want to get after particular groups, how to get after them. And today it's Russia, tomorrow it might be some other country. In other words, this lack of exposing the beneficial owner has bad consequences even for countries that think they're not directly affected at the moment. So it's absolutely crucial, I would argue, for developing countries, because we don't have that bargaining power. But we do need this information. It's absolutely crucial to ensure not just that this information is shared between states, but that it is publicly available. Because let's face it, we are also facing elites in our countries who are able to influence governments to restrict transparency within our countries. So we really do need this information to be public. It's not just something to be shared between states. And it is only through that kind of public awareness that we would have citizens' movements to demand adequate, just a fair playing field, making sure that the rich are also paying just even their fair share of the enhanced wealth.
Right, and we actually have a follow-up from the same journalist, Sarah Paez, which is kind of, along the lines you're talking about with transparency. And the question is for Gabriel: how would G20 leaders ensure that a global asset registry could actually be accessed by everyone and regardless of nationalities? Many EU countries have beneficial ownership registries for land and properties, as you described, yet they differ on whom they allow to access that data. Some have to be citizens of those countries or EU citizens. So how would you get around that? How would you make it more accessible? And who would develop the guidelines for that global asset registry? So building on a question from earlier as well.
Yeah, it's a very important question. And look, I think, again, it makes sense to start from what's happening with the current real estate and land registries that exist and that have existed for centuries. And in most cases that I know of, these registries are fully public. For instance, I don't know, if I want to look up who owns a certain apartment or building in New York City, I can connect, there's a website, I can enter the address, and the website just tells me, okay, that building, that property belongs to this or that person. I can also type in names, specific names, and see if any name shows up as owning some piece of real estate in New York. And it's been like that for a very long time. There's a very long track record, with these real estate and land registries. And I'm not aware of cases where this information has been abused. You could imagine, people sometimes are concerned, and I think there are legitimate concerns about privacy and so on. And then, what makes sense is to look at the track record, the history with these public real estate registries. Have they led to abuse? Not that I know of. So why should we do differently for financial wealth than for real estate and land? It's not very clear. So my general feeling is, let's build on the institutions that exist, that have a long track record. Let's improve them, let's modernize them, let's make them more comprehensive. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to update those institutions to the reality of 21st century wealth.
Great, very clear, thank you. And I have a final question now for all three of you, and this would also be your opportunity to give any closing remarks that you may want to offer. And it's a question coming from Kevin Pinner, who is a reporter at Law 360. And I'll start with Jayati, then go to Gabriel and give our final word to Icrict's chair, José Antonio. What are the main political obstacles to achieving asset registries in the global, local, and regional contexts? So over to you, Jayati.
Well, I think this is related to a question from Nicola Borzi as well about what's different about the current situation and how do we think, I mean, this has been proposed over and over again. Why do we think it would be any better now? I do think the attempt of Western leaders to try and go after Russian oligarchs is, if you like, the thin end of the wedge. It is something which has made it aware, made governments aware of the fact that this lack of knowledge is a limitation even for them. That if in the urge to protect your own elites, you end up protecting all kinds of people who you may not want to at different points protect. It also, I believe, has drawn much more public attention to the kinds of wealth that are held and the different forms in which they're held and in the ways in which at least some of them can be quite easily identified, whether they are yachts or paintings, which earlier people thought you can't identify. Now suddenly everyone knows which oligarch owns which yacht. So I think the global situation now is a little bit different in terms of slightly more willingness to accept the possibility and the need for this kind of knowledge. To make it publicly available will be a bigger fight, but I think it is something that is possible. I think that the political obstacles are obviously huge. I mean, obviously the rich will oppose it. Obviously the wealthy have got greater lobbying power. Obviously there is crony capitalism around the world. We know all of that. We also know that that can be confronted if there is sufficient people power. If there's enough mobilization, if there's enough awareness and knowledge of the fact that it is not so difficult. Once again, it's absolutely true. What José Antonio and Gabriel have been saying, look, there is a history of land registration and public knowledge about land ownership. And in fact, most developing countries are actually trying to deal with and somehow digitize and put it up for open access land records. If you can do it for land records, it is much easier to do it for financial asset holding because all financial institutions have those records in digitized form. Making them share it, there is no obvious reason why they should not be sharing it just the way land records are shared. So it is possible, we just need a much more broad-based citizens movement demanding it, which will be hard then for governments to refuse.
Good, thank you, Jayati. And Gabriel, any final remarks from you or additions on the political obstacles?
Look, I 100% share Jayati's optimism. I think we'll get there. I think the logic is strong. The information exists. There is a legitimate public interest for the collection and publication of this information. There is a strong demand from people from all over the world. And it may take a bit of time, but sometimes progress happens much faster than you would think. I remember I started working on offshore wealth at the time of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And at the time, there was really no exchange of information, of bank information across countries. The notion that there could be an automatic exchange of bank information at the time was deemed as completely utopian, some crazy idea, ivory tower idea, or proposal by NGOs that would never see the light of day. And now it's a reality, and you can see how new forms of international cooperation can emerge in relatively short periods of time, of a few years or 1 decade. So I'm hopeful that we'll get there too for this global asset registry.
Very optimistic. I am appreciating that. And it's a reminder to all of us working in NGOs to keep up with our crazy ideas because they can become reality, I hope. So over to you, José Antonio, for the final word.
Yeah, let me perhaps, on complementing the answer to the first question, my answer to the first question, is that I think what we need is to build strong national aid registries. The IMF can play a very important role in that regard. I think that's one step. And then we need an international agreement about how to exchange information. We don't need an institution to manage all the information. What we need is a good system to exchange information among tax authorities when they want it. And that, I think, could be a UN convention on global assets, or the Global Asset Registry, or a system of national asset registries. Now, regional institutions can play a role, and the European Union is planning to work on this area. And let me say that any agreement will have to include very strong rules against those territories that don't want to be transparent, which are the tax havens. So either the tax haven become transparent, or they have to, somehow the system has to eliminate the financial transactions with them. That's of course, a radical proposal, but I think it has to be part of the agreement, because otherwise this will not work. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us today, especially our brilliant speakers, for your extreme generosity and sharing your time with us. I know your agendas are very busy right now. Your voice, your analysis, your critical understanding really of the challenges in this very uncertain context, I think are decisive in helping us understand where we are and where we need to get to. And this really is a moment for us to tackle offshore wealth. On behalf of Icrict, I would also like to thank the journalists that have joined us today. And don't hesitate to get back to any of us if you need additional information. Do contact Lamia Walalu should you require any more information about this press conference, about the video availability. As I said, it will be on YouTube through TJN's website. And you can also contact Lamia if you would like any more interviews. And let me just close by saying there are solutions clearly out there. There can be no more excuses, as we've heard today. There are no more excuses of pandemics, no more excuses of wars, where we can avoid talking about and dealing with this offshore wealth. If anything, these convergent crises just make the situation that much more urgent. Icrict is making that clear today. Let's hope that the G20 leaders are listening and that they take action. Thank you all.